The talk I'm going to give today, I really want, of course, to be useful to you. So please ask as many questions as you want. I'm kind of mostly going to lay out context, and there are lots of different directions one could take it. So whatever works for you, I'm happy to talk about. Okay, so if anyone has ever heard the name Maimonides before, it's pretty likely that the Maimonides you've heard of is this gentleman pictured here, namely Moses Maimonides. This is a portrait of him, though he lived in the 12th century. This is a portrait made in the 19th century. Of course, people have no idea what he actually looked like. So this is an interesting portrait because it shows you what 19th century European Jews thought an Arab Jew, a Middle Eastern rabbi, should look like, and we kind of see the Orientalist imagery there and so on. But anyway, if you have heard of Moses Maimonides, I wouldn't be altogether surprised because he's quite famous and his renown has been really long-lasting and well-deserved in several different areas. First as a philosopher, both a Jewish philosopher, but also a general philosopher. Really one of the world's foremost, I would say. He's the author of the famous Guide of the Perplexed, one of my favorite titles of all time. Among many other works, he wrote in Arabic, he wrote in Judeo-Arabic, which is basically Arabic in Hebrew script, and he also wrote in Hebrew, depending on what he was, what type of work he was writing. But the Guide of the Perplexed is one of his works that tried to bridge classical learning, especially Aristotelian thought, with monotheism, Judaism especially. If we can recall what the 12th century looked like in world history, we can remember that Europe had by that time pretty much lost its classical traditions, which it had rejected as pagan, and it took Jews and Muslims and others working on Aristotle and Plato and other works, translating them to bring that tradition back to Europe, which happens in the Renaissance and onwards. So Maimonides was certainly one of the scholars who did that work. He was also a leading physician. He was a medical doctor. Not only did he serve as the personal doctor to Saladin's court in Egypt, he also wrote all kinds of medical books and treatises, which are still in use, some of them in medical schools today. I'm sure all of you have seen somewhere or another a Maimonides Medical School. It's a common name for medical schools. Finally, of course, he was probably one of the greatest rabbis who ever lived. He was a Talmudic scholar whose commentaries themselves became part of Jewish law. So for all these reasons, there's a saying about Moses Maimonides in Hebrew that places him on no less a high level than that of Moses, the biblical personality, the lawgiver. It says, Moshe li Moshe en kmo Moshe. From Moses to Moses, there's no other like Moses. So just to see what level we're talking about. But there's another Maimonides we don't hear so much about. Actually, there are several other Maimonides we don't hear so much about. If we think about the women who mostly go unnamed and unrecorded in medieval Jewish history. But I want to talk about David Maimonides today. Moses' younger brother. He was 9 years younger, almost more like a son, but nonetheless his sibling. And he's the subject of my presentation today. So David Maimonides was no intellectual slouch himself. He studied with his brother, but his life's work was nonetheless more grounded in the material, shall we say, rather than the spiritual. He was a long-distance merchant. Okay? This was a fairly typical profession for a Jew in the medieval world. In fact, in Christian Europe, Jews were almost the only, I can almost say the exclusive people who were long-distance merchants in Europe. Christian Europeans didn't engage in long-distance trade at that time, not nearly to the degree Jews did. In the Islamic world, Muslims did this work as well, and occasionally some Christians in the Islamic world did too. But in the Islamic world, where the Maimonides family lived their whole lives, they really stood out as Jews stood out in this profession for reasons I'll get to in this talk. David Maimonides spent what we will see as a tragically short life, engaged specifically in the long distance trade between North Africa, the Middle East, and India. Huge distances to cover in the 12th century, mind you. He traveled either by camel caravan, if he was going overland, or by sea on ships like this one that we see here. And he traded primarily in gems, luxury items, but mostly gems. So today I'm going to talk about David and the world he inhabited as a means to get to some of these larger issues at stake. And in the process, I'm also going to introduce you to a pretty amazing source for the medieval Mediterranean world, particularly the economic world, but also religion, empire, all these things Alan was talking about. And this source is known as the Cairo Geniza. So I want to start with a quick sketch of the geopolitical context in which David Maimonides operated. The Maimonides family was originally from Cordoba in Spain, in Islamic Spain, what the Arabs called Al-Andalus, and where both Moses and David were born in the middle of the 12th century. Now, the important thing to know about Islamic Spain, which all of you world historians probably already know about Islamic Spain, is that it was, to use two very anachronistic terms, it was both tolerant and diverse, right? These are values for us today, like multiculturalism and so on. These are words and concepts that are familiar to us today. These would not be concepts or values at the time. Nonetheless, if we're using our contemporary vocabulary, we would describe Islamic Spain as relatively tolerant and relatively diverse. So under Muslim rule, members of the three monotheistic faiths, which is to say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were able to create intellectually rich and politically moderate sort of cultures that allowed for the best and the brightest to flourish, regardless of their religion. So this intense cooperation between Jews, Muslims, and Christians is sometimes called convivencia. I'm sure you've heard that term. It flourished, especially in areas like philosophy and architecture, poetry, music, theology, translation, which I already mentioned, and so on. These kinds of advances made Islamic Spain the most advanced place in Europe by far during this period. So for the Maimonides family in particular, keep in mind that this was a time when Jews elsewhere in Europe were being ostracized and expelled. Yet Jews in Islamic Spain were leading armies, they were serving as government ministers, they were making scientific discoveries, they were translating classical Greek knowledge into Arabic, and they were engaging in long distance trade. I can't resist sharing this quotation by the contemporary Iranian philosopher, Jahanbegloo, comparing Islamic Spain with the rest of Europe at the time. He says, while Europe was darkened at sunset, Cordoba, the largest city and the seat of the Muslim Moorish Empire in Spain, was illuminated by public lamps. Europeans bathed in streams and lakes. The citizens of Cordoba had over 1,000 bathhouses. Europe was infested with vermin. People in Muslim Spain changed their undergarments daily. Europeans walked in mud. Cordoba's streets were paved. Europe's palaces had smoke holes in the ceiling. Cordoba's arabesque architecture was exquisite. Europe's nobility could not sign its name. Cordoba's children went to school. Europe's monks could not read the baptismal service. Cordoba's teachers created a library with over 2 million books on every subject of human life. Probably a bit of an exaggeration, nonetheless, you get the general point. Now, this interfaith utopia, as it were, was interrupted by the rise of a much less tolerant dynasty, the Almohads, a Berber, or what we call in the field, Amazigh Berber. Berber is actually not a very nice word. It's a Roman and later Arabic word that you can hear the roots of the term barbarian in there. So in the field of North African studies, we use the term they use for themselves, which is Amazigh, which means basically free person. Hard word to write, don't worry about it. But just I feel compelled to add that correction. But anyway, this group called the Almohads, who come from southern Morocco, rise up and take over most of North Africa into Spain, and they're much less tolerant of minorities like Jews. And the Maimonides family is forced to flee Spain for Fez in today's Morocco. And then they even have been forced to convert to Islam for a period, though that's hotly debated. Just as an aside, keep in mind that this Almohad period of oppression and persecution of Jews was very much the exception in the Islamic world, not the rule. Generally speaking, Jews fared quite well in the Islamic world, significantly better than they did in Europe. Up until the modern era, and even then one could say the modern era, there's something like a Shoah, Holocaust in the Islamic world, and so on. Book burdens or this kind of stuff. It was generally an easier place for Jews to live. Now, even in their exile, I would say exile within an exile, Jews are diasporic people, but their exile first from Jerusalem, then from Spain. The Maimonides family carried with them a strong sense of pride, a kind of Spanish elitism with regard to their Andalusi roots. And that sentiment would also be carried by the exiles, the masses of Jews who are expelled from Spain a few centuries later, in 1492. These people were educated, they were cultured, and they left Spain with their heads held high. They were the Jews of Sepharad. Sepharad, which is a biblical term that comes to mean Spain later, and from which we derive the term Sephardic Jews. We should be careful also, and just again, another aside we can develop if people are interested. People like binaries, they like thinking black and white, rich, poor, and so on. And similarly, the Jewish world is often divided into Sephardic and Ashkenazi, Ashkenaz being basically the Rhineland, and later extrapolated to mean Europe, European Jews, Eastern European Jews especially. But in fact, there are lots of other kinds of Jews in the world, Persian Jews, Arab Jews, Kurdish Jews, so on, who are neither Sephardic nor Ashkenazi. Anyway, the Maimonides family were certainly Sephardic Jews, those who were exiled from Spain. Here's an image of the Maimonides family home in Fez. Maybe they lived there again. Who knows? The Moroccans like to commemorate this with a plaque and believe that Maimonides family lived there. From Morocco, they moved on to Palestine, but it was not very friendly under Crusader rule at that time. So they backtracked to Egypt, where they settled in Fustat, the name for Old Cairo, in 1168. And this is the Maimonides live in Cairo, where it is believed Maimonides' original burial place was. It was later moved to Israel. This is where in Egypt where David's story really begins. So David was responsible for the family gem business. At first, this involved his joining existing caravans that went from Egypt to North Africa and the Levant. Okay? These were mixed caravans. This is important to know that these caravans included both Jews and Muslims. We know this because there's a genre of literature called responsa literature, where people would, it's the exact same thing as the fatwa in the Islamic tradition, where Jews would write to rabbis with questions saying, is it okay if I'm on this caravan crossing through the Sinai and it's the Sabbath and I'm supposed to rest, but if I rest, the caravan's going to go on without me and I'm going to die in the desert. Is it okay if I skip observing the Sabbath so that I can continue with this caravan? And so and the rabbis would answer yes. So we know that these were mixed caravans because we have these kinds of letters, especially in the Geniza, which I'll talk about in a moment. As the business grew, as the Maimonides gem business accrued more and more wealth, he had to travel further distances, usually eastward, usually to India. India, of course, being kind of the backbone of the world economy at the time, and also the source of many gems. So garnets, lapis lazuli, which I think is mostly from Afghanistan, was used as a currency. It was one of the most important stones there was. Also emeralds, rubies, and diamonds, though I think it's a few centuries later that the technology for cutting and polishing diamonds comes about. Caravan travel was very dangerous given the hazards of the desert, with little water and marauding tribes and so on. But sea travel was even scarier and more hazardous with its constant threat of pirates, shipwrecks, and drowning. Now, despite these hazards, David, and by extension many other Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, was able to succeed as a merchant. I would point out that in David's particular case, it's not that he achieved vast sums of wealth. I don't think he was extremely wealthy, but it's significant that he made enough money to support his brother. And his brother's career, in turn, was nothing less than sort of decisive in the lives of, one could say, millions of people over hundreds of years. So this money, even if quantitatively was not huge, qualitatively was extremely, extremely important. So if we had to boil it down, the success that David Maimonides had in the gem business can be attributed to three essential aspects of Jewish minority life, primarily in the Islamic world, but I think it extends beyond that as well. The first is mobility, physical mobility, certainly, but also sort of a broader mobility that comes from minorities' characteristic willingness to experiment, to take risks, right? Almost because they have to, right? Majorities don't have to. Like, majorities can much more easily just stay with the status quo. Minorities have an incentive to take risks, including economic risks. Now, I mentioned this already, that Jews were a highly mobile people and they were involved in trade, but we've all heard that stereotype, the wandering Jew, which is a stereotype, but it has some truth to it in the sense that Jews are a diasporic people. They are not traditionally attached to land. Their home is the Torah, hence Jewish law and Jewish tradition and Jewish culture. So there's not a real physical home there. We won't get into nationalism and Zionism. that's a much later period. But in this context of homelessness, of exile, any one area was as good as another, right? It was not a big deal for Jews who weren't particularly rooted in any one place to travel great distances, to study with a rabbi, to contract a marriage, to do business. So a woman and women, Jewish women, were much more mobile than their Gentile counterparts. It wasn't unusual for a Jewish woman, let's say from Tangier or Tunis, to travel to Beirut, to Istanbul, even to Livorno, to southern Italy, to get married, because the families contracted a fortuitous marriage. So this mobility, in turn, helped Jews build strong networks. I think that's a second very important aspect to some Jewish success in long-distance trade in this period. These networks, maybe they were family networks that are forged through marriage, or intellectual networks that are forged through study, economic networks, obviously, forged through business. And all of these overlap and interweave. Now, an advantage that Jews had in forging these long-distance networks was their knowledge of a common language. Jews had a common language, not to mention a common religion, but a common language in which to communicate. So Hebrew, which we think of as only a religious language, a language for the synagogue, in fact could be pressed into use, and was pressed into use when that Jewish bride would travel beyond the Arabic-speaking world to, let's say, Livorno or Amsterdam or wherever. Hebrew could be used until the local language was learned. In addition, in terms of language, Jews tend to be both more literate, read and write more, and more multilingual. They spoke more languages than their non-Jewish neighbors, which also helped forge these kinds of networks. Finally, there's a certain amount of minority solidarity, right? Trust that could really, undergird, strengthen these networks. Because the Jewish community was connected, people knew each other, they knew families. You could do business with a handshake for this reason. Still today, if you go to the diamond dealers, the Hasidic diamond dealers in Antwerp, they do multi-million-dollar diamond deals with a handshake, because you don't cheat someone if they know your cousins and your wife and if all these families are connected. So this kind of underlying trust, which is not to say people didn't cheat, but if you did cheat, everyone would know, and it would hurt your business eventually. You wouldn't get away with it. So when it came to gems in particular, these strong family networks among Jews could eliminate a lot of the risk of theft, right? Gems are small, you're passing them from hand to hand. In long distance trade, usually one individual didn't go the whole way. They would pass the money or the goods to somebody else along the way. We saw use of this in the silver, among merchants there as well. So when you're trading luxury goods like gems, trust is very, very important. And to, give that, handful of rubies to your cousin who gives it to, your brother-in-law's, stepson or whatever it is, those linkages were very, very useful. Finally, being mobile requires packing light. We should all remember this when we go on our summer vacations, myself especially. But this is one reason why long-distance merchants like David tended to specialize in luxury goods. Luxury goods tended to be light. Think of Chinese merchants in silk, right? So the Jews' involvement in the gem trade was very similar. Camel caravans couldn't carry a lot, right? Ships could carry a little bit more, but you weren't going to be carrying lumber. You didn't make, the margins weren't good enough. The margins were very good vis-a-vis the weight in particular with gems. Okay, so let me quickly shift to talk about our sources as promised. Most of what we know about David Maimonides comes from the Cairo Geniza. Geniza is a depository for sacred Hebrew books that are no longer usable. Anything with the name of God on it can't be just thrown away. It has to be buried like a human being. But these accumulate because Jews put the name of God on everything, especially in the medieval period. Their grocery lists have, thank God I'm going to go buy some milk. So, these had to be stored before they were buried. This particular cache called the Cairo Geniza, Genizas could exist everywhere, lasted because it was in Cairo, a dry, arid climate, and it was found in the beginning of the 18th century, but the documents themselves are from the 9th century onward. And we see what on the left, that's kind of a reconstruction of how it was used. But this is an amazing source, not only for Jewish history, Jewish economic history, but in fact for Mediterranean history as a whole in the medieval period. But among its treasures are letters between the Maimonides brothers, like this one. This is a letter from David to his brother Moses from 1170. And in it, we learn that David had intended to travel from Egypt to the Sudanese port of Aida by caravan to meet with merchants there, but he misses the caravan and decides to travel in a small group instead, which is very, very dangerous. He gets to Aida, and they find out that the caravan they wanted to join up with had already left. And in fact, the people in it had died. They had been attacked, and many of the people had died. And he wants to write to his brother to say, look, don't worry, I wasn't actually on it in the end. But he says that since he wasn't on it and the merchants he was supposed to meet up with had been killed, he has to go further afield to try and get other goods. So he's going to go to India. And Moses never wanted him to go to India. Every time he went, he worried and worried. He said, no, I have to go to India. I don't have time to read this full letter to you, but in the end he says, well, I'm going to go to India. Please take care of my wife and my daughter while I'm gone. So these networks also involve taking care of family. The merchant would be out, and whoever was benefiting from his work would have the family, would take care of the family. Now, Moses was right to be worried because that was actually David's last letter home to his family. He died on the voyage to India after his ship sank. His brother never got over it. There's one of the most poignant letters from Maimonides who talks about the death of his brother as the worst disaster that ever struck him, and that for a year he couldn't get out of bed, and so on. Now, in addition to the emotional toll, and there's a beautiful letter about that I'll show you guys. There was also a financial toll from this point forward, because the ship had sunk with the gems, and not only their gems, but also their money and gems and money entrusted to David and Maimonides from other people in the community. That's how these networks work. They had to pay those back. This once wealthy family was poor just because of one shipwreck. Their gems had sunk. Moses had been known for refusing to be paid for his religious work, for being a rabbi. A professional rabbi didn't exist at that time. Rabbis had other jobs. So at this point, he has to go to work as a doctor day and night in Saladin's court, and he sees patients all day, all night. He writes a famous letter about how exhausted he is. He has to only eat a sandwich standing up in the middle of the night. And that's due to the loss of his brother, but that's a whole other story. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure.